Did the most powerful military order in the Middle Ages actually escape to Scotland with their legendary treasure, or was this story invented centuries later to romanticize a broken order? October 13th, 1307. The Knights Templar are being purged across France. According to testimony given under extreme duress, a fleet of 18 ships slipped out of the port of La Rochelle under the cover of darkness, vanishing into the Atlantic. The destination? Legend insists they sailed north to the only place in Europe where the Pope's writ held no power, Scotland. But we need to separate the romance from the reality. For 700 years, we've been fed stories of secret lineages, hidden grails, and Templar knights charging at Bannockburn to save Scottish independence. Yet, is there any physical proof? Did the Templars really survive in the Scottish mist, or is this entire narrative just propaganda? Welcome to Hidden Epics. Today we are dissecting one of the most enduring mysteries of the Middle Ages. To understand why Scotland became the supposed sanctuary, you have to understand the sheer desperation of 1307. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, was heavily in debt to the Templars. He didn't just want them gone, he needed their wealth to balance his books. He decided to liquidate his creditors in a coordinated dawn raid that was essentially a medieval special operations strike. On that infamous Friday the 13th, the order was crushed. Torture, false confessions, and burning at the stake became the new reality for these soldiers of Christ. However, the political landscape in Scotland offered a unique loophole. The Scottish king, Robert the Bruce, was already excommunicated. He had murdered his rival, the Red Cummin, on the holy ground of a church in Dumfries. He was an outlaw in the eyes of Rome and had nothing left to lose. This created a perfect geopolitical storm. If you are a fleeing Templar knight hunted by the Vatican and the King of France, where do you go? You run to the one king who was already damned. It is the perfect setup for a blockbuster movie, but history suggests it might be pure wishful thinking. Today, we are going to examine the evidence, from the so-called treasure fleet to the mysterious graves at Rosslyn, to answer one question: was the Scottish escape history or just hype? The entire foundation of the Scottish escape theory rests on a single, fragile piece of testimony. Jean de Chalon, a serving brother of the order, claimed that the night before the arrests, he personally witnessed carts filled with straw-covered boxes leaving the Paris temple. He testified that these carts traveled to the port of La Rochelle and were loaded onto 18 galleys. When the king's men arrived the next morning to seize the fleet, the harbor was empty. The ships simply evaporated. Where did they go? While Portugal was a logical destination, the king there simply rebranded them as the Order of Christ. The Scottish theory argues they braved the treacherous currents of the Irish Sea to land in Argyll. The tactical logic holds up. Robert the Bruce was fighting a desperate guerrilla war against England. He needed trained heavy cavalry. The Templars were the special forces of their day, heavily armored, disciplined, and terrifying in a charge. It seems like a match made in heaven. However, the archaeological record tells a starkly different story. There is absolutely zero physical evidence of this fleet arriving. We have no harbor master records from the time indicating an arrival of this magnitude. There was no sudden influx of French gold in the Scottish treasury, which remained nearly bankrupt throughout the war. We have found no weapons, no shipwrecks, and no French relics in the mud. If 18 ships loaded with the greatest treasure of the East landed in Scotland, they managed to do so without leaving a single footprint behind. This brings us to 1314 and the Battle of Bannockburn. This event is the holy grail of Scottish Templar mythology. The narrative is compelling. The Scots are massively outnumbered. The English heavy cavalry is grinding them down. Suddenly, a fresh force of knights charges onto the field, bearing the Bosant, the black and white banner of the temple. The English, terrified of these holy warriors who were supposed to be dead, break rank and flee in terror. It is a stirring image. It suggests that the Templars didn't just hide, they saved Scotland and secured its independence. Yet the primary sources from the era are deafeningly silent. We have detailed chronicles of Bannockburn. We know the names of the nobles present, the positionings of the schiltrons, and the flow of the battle. Not a single contemporary chronicler mentions the Templars. The first time this specific story appears in print isn't in 1314 or even 1414. It was popularized in the 19th century by writers looking to add a layer of mysticism to the Scottish identity. The reality of that charge is likely a confusion with the Sma folk. These were the camp followers, servants, women, and wagon drivers who fashioned homemade weapons and pots on sticks. Seeing the English waver, they charged down the hill late in the battle to join the fight. To the terrified and exhausted English army, they looked like a fresh reinforcement of thousands. Over the centuries, a ragtag group of camp followers didn't feel like a legendary enough explanation for such a monumental victory. Secret knights offered a more romantic narrative, but history suggests this legend was crafted to add mystique to a victory that was actually won by gritty Scottish pikes, not noble French exiles. You can't discuss Templars in Scotland without addressing Rosslyn Chapel. Thanks to pop culture phenomena like the Da Vinci Code, this chapel near Edinburgh is now zero ground for conspiracy theories. The chapel was built by the Sinclair family, who are often cited by theorists as the hereditary Grand Masters of the secret Scottish Templars. Tour guides often point to carvings that look like ears of corn, a plant native to the Americas which shouldn't exist in Europe yet, and claim this proves the Templars had secret knowledge of the New World. But chronology is the enemy of this theory. Rosslyn Chapel was founded in 1446. That's nearly 150 years after the Templars were destroyed. Connecting Rosslyn to the fleeing Templars is like connecting a modern skyscraper to the American Civil War. The timeline simply doesn't fit. While the Sinclairs were a powerful family, the idea that they were harboring a secret order for 150 years without anyone noticing implies a level of operational security that simply didn't exist in the Middle Ages. As for the corn carvings, botanists have identified them as stylized representations of local plants, likely strawberries or wheat, which were standard allegorical Christian art common in the 15th century. When we look for Templars here, we are often projecting what we want to see rather than observing what is actually carved in stone. So was the entire concept of Templars in Scotland a fabrication? Not entirely, and this is where the actual history is more fascinating than the myths. There were Templars in Scotland, but they didn't arrive on a phantom fleet in 1307. They'd been there for nearly 2 centuries. They owned substantial land and had a headquarters at Ballintradock, a village now literally called Temple in Midlothian. When the papal bull commanding their arrest arrived from France, the response in Scotland was surprisingly bureaucratic. Only 2 Templars were ever interrogated in Scotland. Unlike their brothers in France who faced the rack and the fire, these men were treated with remarkably leniency. They weren't burned, they were essentially told to dissolve their order and stop calling themselves Templars. Most historians believe the Templars in Scotland didn't become a secret society guarding the Holy Grail. They simply walked down the road and joined the calaveras of Hospitallers, or retired to their family estates. They didn't hide in caves, they hid in plain sight. They took off the white mantle with the red cross, put on a different coat, and went back to work. They didn't need a grand conspiracy, they just needed the indifference of a Scottish king who didn't have bigger problems than hunting down old soldiers for a pope he didn't respect. So did the Knights Templar escape to Scotland? If you're looking for a fleet of treasure ships and a secret army that turned the tide at Bannockburn, that's a legend. It's a story crafted to inspire wonder. But if you mean individual men fleeing persecution, finding safety in a land that ignored the Pope's orders, that is almost certainly the truth. They survived not as an order, but as men. Hit like if you love a good mystery and subscribe to Hidden Epics for the full, unvarnished truth about history's biggest lies. Check the related video for the deep dive on the French trials. Sometimes vanishing into the crowd is the greatest trick of all. See you in the next one.